So I've got a lot of questions for you, but let's just start with this one. Can you give us the 2-minute tourist version of the arc of your career from when you started out to where you are now?
Yes, I think I can do that. I was born in Little Fort, British Columbia, a very small town in the interior with about 50 people. I went from there to the University of Saskatchewan and graduated in 1983 with a veterinary degree. And I came to Calgary, Alberta immediately after graduation and started a company called Feedlot Health Management Services. And you can tell by the title, it was a company that was focused on providing veterinary services to feedlots, to the emerging feedlot industry in Western Canada. At the same time, I got involved in cattle ownership and started Kee Jim Farms roughly around the same time. And so I got involved very early in the cattle feeding operations in Western Canada. And then if we wind the clock through several decades, Feedlot Health expanded from an animal health base and became involved in being a one-stop shop for consultation. We expanded to a multidisciplinary group of scientists with expertise in veterinary medicine, nutrition, cattle, sorting, environmental compliance, and we hired statisticians, epidemiologists, and all of the appropriate people to be doing data analytics across all areas of procurement, production, and marketing in feedlots. So it went from a single person to roughly a staff of 150, about a third of which were professional scientists. And that company 3 years ago was sold in its entirety to TELUS Agriculture. We go back to the Kee Jim Farm side, as they started off with a small percentage of a share pen, right? So it was 6% of a share pen of 300 and 90% financed by the feedlot. So represented a net equity of about 2 head. But things were phenomenal here in Western Canada in terms of profitability. And over the next several decades, I grew Kee Jim Farms into a major cattle owner. And starting about 20 years ago, ventured into the US side in terms of cattle ownership, and later in the business model, acquisition of feedlots, which was not part of my game plan early, because the rewards or the return to capital in simply on the cattle was far better than on the farming and feedlot operations. But we did become involved in that over time. And currently we have feedlot operations in Texas, in New Mexico, in Colorado, and we have calf depots from coast to coast where we collect up day olds and bring them into our calf rearing systems. Recently, we opened a large feedlot in Nebraska of 150,000 head in our Black Shirt project. So that's more than 2 minutes, but I tried.
Well, it's kind of tough to condense a career like that into 2 minutes anyway. So that is perfect. We're going to double click on all of that, but let's start with Feedlot Health. So tell us more about the specifics of why did you start it? What was your insight? How did you start it?
It really started when I was in veterinary college. Quite frankly, after the first couple of years, the first year and a half of vet school, I wasn't convinced that this was my calling necessarily, right? So I was looking around to seeing, well, what are the opportunities? What can people with an interest in beef cattle, where are they going to end up? And I was quite horrified to find out what the life of a beef cattle veterinarian looked like. And remember, this is 40 years ago, right? And it looked like a lot of effort in terms of making calls and doing a bunch of tasks, preg checking cows, dystocia, all this kind of stuff. Almost all the things I was trying to avoid by moving away from the ranch. right? So I'm thinking that this is probably not a good fit for me. But fortunately, I encountered a professor by the name of Eugene Jansen, who's acted as a mentor for me just about my whole life. And he was getting involved in the emerging feedlot industry in Saskatchewan. So he had a lot of contacts with feedlot owners, and he was doing the veterinary work at those feedlots. So I got very interested in that because what I could see is that it had scale and these operations could grow to be sizable, and they were also making money, right? Which wasn't something I was convinced that cow-calf producers were necessarily doing. So just really first principles, right? Service businesses that are profitable, right? And by doing so, you have a much better chance of success. So I figured, well, I really want to get involved in this feedlot thing and provide, veterinary services to feedlots. So I got focused on that in vet college and did some traveling. And in Alberta, which was a much bigger center of feedlot activity, it struck me that the veterinary practitioners were in the general practice mode, right? They hadn't recognized this emerging large-scale industry, and that the attributes required to service it would be very different than what they had done in mixed animal practice, right? So I guess my insight was that I knew that there was an opportunity because the current practitioners weren't really recognized as a big deal, and that this thing was going to really become something. So I just could, at that point in time, hardly wait to get out, right? So, because I thought, well, this is a pretty good opportunity that's just sitting right there. And at the same time, I think the second insight was there's going to be a lot of data here, and how are we going to collect this data, and how is it going to be analyzed, and how is the data going to lead to usable insights. So I got involved in, Eugene had a computer program, which was the data was collected in the field, and then via cards, it came into the veterinary college and was entered into a mainframe system. So a pretty awkward system, but what it taught me was that really wasn't going to work very well because of the time lags and all the stuff. I felt that it had to be chute side, right? And you had to figure out a way of getting, data collection systems, computers chute side. And in 1985, a couple of years after graduation, that became possible with the advent of the IBM PC, right? So suddenly you were able to, collect data chute side. But the first system that we put in on a single hospital, it was $12,000, right? Just to give you an idea. And remember, that wasn't a network. That was a standalone system. So a lot of people have no, they just take it for granted that, the data flow existed. Well, it didn't at that point in time. And by understanding that was going to be required, and made the efforts to develop software. So I got involved in software development in 1984, and was able to put the first system chute side in 1985. I'm not a computer programmer. I hired people to get this done. So that was the beginning of our proprietary software package that ultimately expanded into all aspects of feedlot production. The overarching idea was we need to collect data. Today, we would call that data analytics and that sort of thing, but that was quite new for the feedlot industry. It certainly was the first in Canada, and I believe that it was very close to being one of the first systems that went in North America. So it was all about, I knew that it was going to be about data and the analysis of the data. And fortunately, because it was so new, there was low-hanging fruit that was there in the first few years, that even with someone with very basic training in epidemiology and statistics were able to figure out from looking at the data. And one of the real innovations that came through was identifying that the cattle get sick in and around arrival at the feedlot, and they don't wait 2 weeks like the textbook had indicated. And it wasn't until we uniquely identified all of the cattle on arrival and were able to plot that epidemic curve, which led to the use of prophylactic antibiotics. Again, commonplace today, not so 40 years ago. I believe that I was the first one at scale to do the prophylactic antibiotics, and that really helped on terms of reducing mortality and treatment rates. But it emerged through simple data analysis. So we're well into utilizing, computers and data analytics. But I also think that equally as important would have been really changing the veterinary client relationship, because I could see that, the standard fee for service, I was going to get paid by the postmortem, and called when the feedlot owner perceived that there was needed, wasn't going to be a very viable model for either myself or for the client, right? So we had to get to something different than fee for service or fee for hours. And that's where I decided that I need to be charged out on a per head per day basis. A common metric in feedlots is the cattle feeding day. We calculate everything basis cattle feeding days. So I thought, well, I need to be attached to that number, and I need to be paid, basis cattle feeding days, so that there was a, mutual alignment of incentives between myself and the feedlot owner. Because under the real standard arrangement, the irony is the more problems the feedlot would have would mean more dead cattle. And if you're charging by the postmortem, well, your revenue suddenly went up on the feedlot's worst day. So it just seemed like a really, really horrible model. And if you combine that, again, this is 40 years ago, the veterinarians were in the business of pharma supply. So they were the prescriber and also the pharmacist. And unfortunately, there's a pretty big potential for misalignment there, right? Because again, once again, if you're supplying pharma, well, the more you buy, the more money I make, right? And it hardly serves as an incentive to really develop comprehensive preventive programs on all of that sort of thing. So again, that idea was pretty attractive to the feedlots, right? Because it was an entirely different business model than they were used to, and they could see very clearly how great alignment could occur when you change the whole nature of that interaction. So really a couple of things: changing the nature of the business structure, using data, and then very shortly thereafter, creating significant research programs at all of the feedlots. We used the large pen model. It's not like we had a separate research facility. We just utilized what we had and pioneered the large pen assessments that are common today. And we very quickly realized that, we were generating, IP, we were generating knowledge that was immediately translatable. It's not like we were analyzing data and coming up with nothing in terms of recommendations or how to change. All of that work that we did and the work we do today can result in a change in our operational procedures at the feedlot or in our production practices. So I was just looking at it here a little while ago. We've literally done thousands of research projects across multiple feedlots over a 40-year period. So a real key thing, data and research driving the engine of change and the underlying business model.
And it's incredible to me that you stumbled across these three insights in your 20s, in your early 20s.
Early 20s, yeah.
So one of the things that I find interesting is when we talk about the venture world of ag tech companies and data analytics and capturing more data and then doing something with that data, if you look at the venture-backed companies, they really haven't delivered as much as what the bootstrapped companies from the 80s and 90s have delivered to their industries. And to me, the technology that you developed with Feedlot Health and those types of long-lasting industry practice changing insights, that really speaks to kind of the OG companies from that era, made a huge impact on this industry across all segments of livestock and agriculture.
Yes, and I think some of the other We did have early wins, which is essential for driving a business model that were very substantial in terms of reducing animal health costs and reducing mortality. And then it was a natural steps to start to look at other areas of the feedlot, such as the nutritional area, and start to bring in all of the nutritionists. So you're building this multidisciplinary team over time, with statisticians, epidemiologists, meat scientists, etc. And we're now over 60 people. It might even be higher than that. Well, we have the largest aggregation of scientists in the discipline and would be bigger than many of the university departments. Right. So we've created an ecosystem of this in private enterprise, and it's been fascinating to watch it grow over the years. It's been really interesting to go from Western Canadian company base to the rest of Canada, and then into the US in a major way, then into Mexico. And we've done projects across the world, been involved in Russia, in China, in Kazakhstan, in Mongolia, in any place that fed cattle production occurs. So it's been an interesting journey. And one of the things that came along that really helped us on the technology side was digital imaging, right? Because a critical control point for animal health programs is the necropsy information. And if you can believe it, we started out taking still photos of necropsies and then processing the film and looking at it. Of course, there's a huge delay when we did that, right? But when the digital thing first, came out, we embraced that, developed, very, very precise protocols for how necropsies need to occur in the field. And then that's, obviously being done by a feedlot employee, and then loading up those images and, coming into the office here. So today we have images coming in from over 200 primary production sites, and literally by the thousands, right? So not just for postmortems, you can look at clinical exams of live animals, you can look at all other aspects of things that are happening at the feedlot. The digitalization of the space really helped to deliver the model outside of the scope of our immediate driving area here in Western Canada. We could take what we were doing and insert it wherever we wanted to on the planet and still get a very meaningful data and dialogue with the feedlots, right? So it worked out extremely well, and it certainly helped me in my development as a cattle feeder, because I just got to see so many different operations globally, and to get the ideas to innovate and to look at things differently than you would if you're just focused on a narrow geography.
I can imagine it's that technology allowed you to be much more scalable than what you would have been with just humans in a pickup.
Oh, for sure. The humans in a pickup got old after about the first 3 years, right? Because if you're driving considerable distances, and that's big time downtime, you're not being, it's hard to be productive, and as well, it's not that safe, right? As you're thinking about other things driving around, and unfortunately, the motor vehicle catastrophes are part of the, a part of the real risks of rural practice, right? It's just not. You've been able to do things in the office here, centralize all the data, have all the data flowing in at 2 p.m. and have it ready the next day for the consultants to utilize, is a phenomenal way of doing service, very cost-effective delivery tool.
Right. So the data and the analytics piece is obviously super fascinating here, but also just that the business model component that you talked about of aligning your incentives with your customers. Would you call that outcome-based pricing? And if so, outcome-based pricing seems like it's one of the holy grails of any innovative business model, but it's super, super difficult to execute. So what are the principles that you use in implementing that pricing model?
It's closer to outcome-based, but interestingly enough, there's been very few feedlots that are interested in paying by the outcome, right? Because depending on what portion of the delta that goes to the consultant, that program could be a lot more expensive than a per head day rate.
Mm-hmm.
Because very early in this thing, I was told by a feedlot operator who became a mentor and a good friend. He said, you know, in this consulting game, you're selling brains by the bucket, right? And you're always going to sell it at a very large discount to its true value, right? Just by the nature of the business. So that provided me considerable motivation to look at other ways of fully monetizing the information. And it became obvious to me the only way you could do that was by owning the cattle, right? In a sense, becoming your both your own best client, right? Because that way you don't get a discount. The value of the information is X per head. You're getting it all, right? So it was a major reason why I got involved in the feeding of the cattle and the ownership of feedlots and so on, was to fully monetize the value of the information.